While the ascent to the Kicking Horse Pass up the Lagan Hill was challenging, the descent from Hector to Field was dramatic. Following 2 comparatively level miles from the summit and around Wappa Lake, the Kicking Horse River plunges 1,142 feet in 2 miles. The syndicate's contract with the Government of Canada stipulated a grade of not more than 2.2%. 2 solutions were considered to meet this requirement on the descent from the Kicking Horse Pass. The first was to follow the north side of the valley, up the Ojo River Valley, and back again. However, this route was rejected because it would pass several unstable areas considered prone to mudslides and avalanches. The second was to follow the south side of the valley, passing 500 feet above Field. But this route would require construction of a 1,400-foot tunnel through the nose of Mount Stephen, which would not only be costly, but take years, not months, to construct. The solution finally adopted was to ask the Government of Canada for a dispensation on the maximum grade and build a temporary track with a 4.5% grade directly down into the Kicking Horse River Valley. This became known as the Big Hill, and, although originally intended to be temporary, lasted in service for 25 years. Operating on the 5-mile, 4.5% grade was hazardous. The track at the front of the locomotive of a 5-car passenger train was 16 feet lower in altitude than that of the rear of the last car of the passenger train. To prevent accidents, the railway adopted strict rules on the Big Hill. The instructions for operating trains on the hill were detailed and very explicit. A special block between the western yard limit of Hector and the eastern yard limit of Field was created for the Big Hill, where both passenger and freight train tonnages and running times were strictly controlled. For the 7.12 miles from Hector to Field, passenger trains were required to run this distance in not less than 47 minutes, with a speed limit most of the way of 8 miles per hour. Careful testing of brakes, sanders, and all related equipment were required before westbound trains could proceed down the grade. A helper locomotive was added to the end of freight trains to assist in braking. The end locomotive on freight trains was placed in front of the caboose, as experience, obtained the hard way, had shown that if the lead locomotive lost power, the rear locomotive could ram the car ahead of it. Eastbound trains were required to add a pusher locomotive to the end of the train before proceeding up the hill. Passenger trains of more than 5 cars were often split to avoid having to add a helper locomotive. If a locomotive was added, a baggage car was frequently positioned mid-train in front of the helper to avoid disastrous results in the event that the lead locomotive lost power. 4 runaway sidings were built about a mile apart. The switches were set to divert downhill trains onto the sidings. As a train approached a siding, it was to give one long blast of the whistle to alert the switchman. Then, if the engineer had the train under control, 4 short blasts to tell the switchman to give the train access to the main line. In the event that the switchman felt the train was going faster than the authorized speed, he could alert all concerned by pushing a button in his shack to activate an electric gong in each of the other shacks and in the operator's office at field. Even when field was reached, safeguards were taken by setting the east switch to divert any following train onto another siding. Careful records were kept of train movements, and telegraph helped dispatchers and switch tenders to monitor the whereabouts of trains. Eventually, an electric staff, or token system, was adopted to regulate train movements up and down the hill. For westbound passenger trains and trains following westbound passenger trains, only one train was allowed in the block between the western yard limit of Hector and the eastern yard limit of Field. Electrical and mechanical devices were used, one at each end of the block, to dispense a 6-inch long steel rod in such a way that a rod could only be taken from the device by the joint action of the operators at both ends of the block. Once the train had reached the other end of the block, the rod was inserted into the electrical device to alert the operators at both ends that the train had cleared the Big Hill block. Today, the Trans-Canada Highway follows the eastern portion of the Big Hill and its 4.5% grade, giving travelers an idea of the severity of the slope. A steel and masonry bridge that replaced the original Howe Truss wooden bridge still sits beside the highway.